Welcome to Build Strong Habits podcast channel. This is an audio podcast, so take your eyes off the screen, sit back, relax, and listen.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're all still kind of reeling from the 2024 election. I think
Yeah,
it really just shook things up everywhere.
for sure.
And I think it's especially for the LGBTQ plus community,
Yeah.
the anxiety is like palpable.
Absolutely. A lot of folks feeling blindsided by the outcome and kind of scrambling to understand what it all means.
Right. And what it could mean for LGBTQ plus rights, especially because, it's not like his campaign was exactly quiet about where they stand on this.
Right.
That
Yeah.
Agenda 47 was, it's sending up red flags for a lot of folks.
It's interesting, though, because Agenda 47 wasn't just like vague political rhetoric. They were really specific about what they wanted to do, and a lot of it was targeted at trans rights, particularly for trans youth.
So let's break that down for our listener. What exactly is in there that has people so worried?
Well, right off the bat, he pledged to revoke the Biden-era protections, like day one.
Oh, wow.
And ban what he calls child sexual mutilation, which, is obviously inflammatory and inaccurate language for gender-affirming care.
Yeah, it's the kind of language that really just, kicks it up a notch in terms of the fear factor, I think.
Absolutely, and it's already such a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
He also wants to eliminate Medicare and Medicaid coverage for healthcare providers who offer gender-affirming care, and even talked about supporting lawsuits against those doctors.
Wow. So not only restricting access for patients, but potentially impacting the livelihoods of the doctors who provide that care.
Exactly.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not just healthcare, right? He was talking a lot about schools and how gender identity is addressed in schools as well.
Yeah, one of his major proposals was to push for legislation that defines gender strictly as male or female assigned at birth and recognized that way at the federal level. So essentially trying to legally erase any recognition of transgender or non-binary identities.
So imagine you're a trans person and you're trying to update your passport, or you're a non-binary student trying to figure out how to navigate school. This isn't some theoretical political debate anymore. This is your life.
Exactly. And it plays into this larger narrative he's pushing about promoting what he calls traditional nuclear families in schools.
I remember that comment he made about schools making decisions about children's gender transitions.
Oh, yeah.
The one where he claimed kids were coming home from school having had surgery.
Yeah. Right.
Come on, that was just so out there and completely false.
Yes.
But it shows you how willing he is to just completely distort reality in order to tap into people's fears.
Yeah, parental fears and anxieties, absolutely.
And unfortunately, it looks like it worked.
Unfortunately, it seems to have resonated with his base, although it's important to note that the majority of Americans actually oppose discrimination against transgender people in areas like housing and employment.
Yeah. So we've got the majority of people supporting basic rights for trans individuals, but a smaller but very vocal group that was totally energized by this rhetoric.
Right.
And that's enough to swing an election.
It's the scary reality that we're looking at.
It's disheartening.
There's even data that shows that those anti-trans political ads, while they did turn off a majority of voters, they were actually really effective at mobilizing a certain segment of the population.
So fear-mongering works even if most people see through it.
That's what we're seeing.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, it's no surprise that LGBTQ plus advocates and community members are expressing a lot of fear and anxiety right now.
Yeah.
For example, Kathy Renna at the National LGBTQ Task Force has been very vocal about the potential for increased discrimination and hate crimes.
Yeah, she has.
And Isa Noyola from the Transgender Law Center has expressed concerns about the Trump administration's ability to really refine their attacks now that they're familiar with the inner workings of government.
So it's like they're coming back with a vengeance almost.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that way.
It's not just talk either. The Trevor Project, which offers crisis intervention and suicide prevention services for LGBTQ youth,
Right.
they saw a massive spike in calls after the election.
They did demand surged by almost 700%, which really speaks to how this rhetoric translates into real-world fear and desperation.
Wow. And Jamie Taylor, a professor at the University of Toledo who's also a trans woman, she called this election an existential crisis for the trans community.
Wow.
Which I think really reflects the fear that a lot of people are going through right now. It's not just about politics. It's about feeling unsafe, unseen, and just uncertain about the future.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a really tough time. And I think it's so easy to get caught up in the emotional reaction to all of this.
Yeah.
But let's try to take a step back for a second and think about what concrete policy changes a second Trump term could actually mean.
Okay, so less about feelings and more about facts. What are we actually looking at here?
Well, one major concern is that Trump could use his executive power to limit federal recognition of gender identities.
Okay.
This could impact all sorts of things, from updating passports and driver's licenses to accessing healthcare and government services.
So for our listeners at home, imagine you're trans and you need to renew your driver's license. Suddenly, this political debate is your reality.
Exactly. It's not about ideology anymore. It's about the practicalities of daily life.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of transgender participation in sports, which was obviously a huge talking point during the campaign.
Oh, yeah.
Trump has already said he supports legislation to restrict trans athletes from competing in alignment with their gender identity.
Yeah. And, it's a complex issue, but a lot of the legislation that we're seeing targets trans youth specifically.
Right.
And it often seems to be coming from a place of misinformation rather than like actual evidence of unfairness or competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's such an important point. There's so much fear-mongering around this, but major medical organizations like the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they all support gender-affirming care.
Right.
They recognize it as safe, effective, and often life-saving.
And, it's worth pointing out that this care, it's not just about surgery, which is what tends to be the focus of the more, kind of sensationalized rhetoric.
Right.
It's counseling. It's hormone therapy. It's social and legal support.
Yeah, it's a whole spectrum of things.
It's about helping these kids live healthy and authentic lives.
Absolutely.
So to restrict access to that puts young people at risk.
It does.
And this isn't just an individual concern either, right? There are potential societal implications to all of this.
Yeah, for sure.
So what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, Jen Grosshandler from GenderCool, which is a group that supports trans youth, has predicted that we're going to see more and more LGBTQ plus families migrating to states with more protective laws.
Wow.
So like Illinois, for example. Essentially, we could see a kind of brain drain from states that are hostile towards LGBTQ plus rights.
So these families might be forced to uproot their lives and move just to feel safe and accepted?
Yeah,
That's a pretty stark reality.
It is, and it's a loss for everyone involved. The states pushing these policies, they lose valuable members of their community.
Right.
And the families relocating face a lot of stress and upheaval.
It's like we're seeing a new wave of political refugees.
Yeah.
And it's not war or famine that's driving them away. It's intolerance and discrimination.
Right.
Pretty disheartening.
It is, but it's important to remember that the LGBTQ plus community has a long history of resilience and activism.
Okay, good. Give our listeners some hope here.
Right.
What are you seeing?
Well, for one thing, there's been a record-breaking number of anti-trans bills introduced in state legislatures recently.
Really?
Which, yeah, it's alarming on the surface, but it also shows that the community is organized and mobilized.
Right.
They're fighting back.
So the more they try to suppress these voices, the louder they get.
Exactly. And then there's the victories, big and small. Look at the election of Sarah McBride to Congress.
Oh my gosh, yeah. The first openly trans person ever elected to Congress?
It's huge.
That is a monumental win, especially in this political climate.
It is, and it shows that progress is possible even in the face of these setbacks.
That does give me some hope. There's a little spark of light in all this darkness.
Exactly. It's important to hold on to those sparks, celebrate those victories, and never stop fighting for equality and justice.
So how can people take all of this anxiety and this fear and channel it into something productive? What can our listener do to actually make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's so easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless, but there are things we can all do.
Okay, good.
And that's what we'll dive into next.
All right, so we've talked about the anxieties, we've talked about some of the potential policy changes that are on the horizon, but let's get practical here. What can our listener, who's probably feeling all of this very personally, what can they actually do?
Yeah, it can feel so overwhelming, right? Like,
Yeah.
where do you even begin?
Right.
But I think the first step is honestly the simplest: stay informed. Knowledge is power, as they say.
So no doom scrolling, no burying our heads in the sand.
Right.
We have to stay engaged, stay aware.
Exactly. Keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening, both at the national level and in your local community.
Yeah.
Read articles, listen to podcasts, follow LGBTQ plus organizations on social media.
Right.
And most importantly, make sure you're registered to vote.
Because elections has consequences, as we've very clearly seen.
Yes, they do.
Voting is the foundation, for sure.
Absolutely.
But what else can people do to sort of actively push back against these attacks on LGBTQ plus rights?
Well, beyond voting, connect with your local advocacy groups, attend rallies and protests, donate to organizations that are fighting on the ground. There is strength in numbers, and just showing up in solidarity really does make a difference.
So collective action.
Yes.
Got it. But what about on a more individual level? Like, what can our listener do in their own lives to make a difference?
Don't underestimate the power of those personal connections. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share information challenge harmful stereotypes and misconceptions when you encounter them. You can be an advocate for change within your own circles.
So be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly.
We can all be champions for equality and inclusion in our own communities.
Yes, and sometimes the most powerful form of activism is simply living your life openly and authentically.
Yeah.
Visibility matters. When LGBTQ plus people are seen and heard, it challenges prejudice and helps to create a more inclusive world.
It's like by being ourselves, by living our truth, we're pushing back against the fear and the ignorance that fuels these attacks.
Absolutely.
That's powerful.
And finally, never underestimate the power of hope. I know things might feel bleak right now, but the LGBTQ plus community has a long history of overcoming adversity. They have fought for their rights, and they have won, and they will continue to do so.
So this isn't the end of the story.
No.
It's just a new chapter, and we get to write it together.
Exactly. And remember, there are so many people out there, individuals, organizations, who are fighting for a better future for all LGBTQ plus people. You're not alone in this.
So important to remember, we're in this together, and together we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay hopeful. The fight for equality continues.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. It's been a heavy but important conversation. As always, we want to leave you with something to think about. How will this current political landscape and public opinion influence the trajectory of LGBTQ plus rights in the years to come? It's a question that I think deserves all of our attention and action.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Build Strong Habits.